So when you train, you're training your fuel system as well. So again, if you're going to always train yourself with carbohydrates, you're going to disincentivize the body from having a lot of mitochondria. I'll show you when we look at the PGC1 alpha master regulatory gene, there's lots of inputs that influence it. It's not just carbs versus fats. Another major thing that you have to consider when you're training your body is training your fuel system as well. So there's recently there's a race called the Western States 100. It's a 100-kilometer race, or I think 100 mile. All right, that takes it even up a notch. So it's like 30 hours. So a paleo primal person won the race this year and beat the course record by about 21 minutes. It's like a 30-hour race, so it's still impressive to beat the record by 21 minutes. And so he wasn't taking in a lot of carbohydrates. The figure is that you have about 2,000 calories worth of glycogen in your body before you completely deplete it. Depending upon your percent body fat and your triglyceride stores in your muscles, you have 20, 30,000 calories available to you if you learn how to train the system to use carbohydrates. So what I'm typically counseling people is when you're training, you want to kind of train in a fasting state if you can, even if you're going to bonk earlier, because you don't want to coddle the body and give it a lot of energy before you work out, because you want to actually deplete your glycogen stores. You want to tap into your triglyceride stores so that when you're in recovery and you get the hunter-gatherer spoils of victory, you're going to actually turn around and train the body to say, wow, you know, I just did, you know, we were talking about Diane today. You know, I just did a benchmark CrossFit routine, and I'm depleted. I better have a little bit more glycogen to kind of do a little bit more next time, and you're going to incentivize your body to kind of store more glycogen. And then you can kind of, in a targeted way, if you have a performance every once in a while, then you can kind of use your carbohydrates to give you a little bit of a performance enhancement boost. But if you're using it too much, then again, you're going to disincentivize the body. You're going to turn off this gene. So let's just take a minute and look at this master regulatory gene. It's called PGC1 alpha. It's an interesting thing in that 1% of DNA that we have differently than chimpanzees. One of the major features is kind of an upgrade in PGC1 alpha so that we can increase our energy production. So I just want to show you from a systems biology perspective what is impacting this. So you have your insulin and your insulin-like growth factor, which is what growth hormone does. Sure. Uh-huh.
But the writing on the left are the definitions of the blue circles, so he'll walk you through each one of those.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Thank you. So insulin is a great way to turn on PGC1 alpha. Interestingly, if you look at the science in the literature, people who carb load before their exercise, when they have their post-exercise recovery meal or carbs, you don't get the insulin response because you're using insulin. And so if you rest that system, your pancreas, which is where your insulin is going to be produced, it's going to keep producing some insulin. It's going to have a lot of insulin ready. And everybody talks about that magical, 20 to 40 minute window after exercise to kind of get your maximal gains. Let's get protein into the cell. Let's get energy into the cell. So you can maximize your insulin response by minimizing your consumption beforehand. T3 is thyroid, so healthy hormone levels. Thyroid's your master metabolic. It runs the rate of your metabolism. Healthy levels of T3 are going to turn on your gene to increase your energy production. Caloric restriction does, and it's an interesting kind of phenomena there. I won't get into it. It's a little bit too deep, but in part, it's because when you're calorically restricted, you're going to have to use your free fatty acids as a fuel source. And again, it's a less efficient fuel. So to compensate, the body's going to turn on this master gene. ATP to AMP is basically the ratio. It's a 10-to-1 ratio between your energy currency and your spent fuel rods. As soon as you start exercising, you start losing that ratio, and it turns on the body saying, all right, we need more energy because the metabolic rate's up, we're working, turn on PGC1 alpha. And then the strongest influencer of PGC1 alpha is some genes like mTOR and Krav, and essentially those get turned on with muscular overload, resistance training, exercise. It doesn't have to be resistance training. It could be anything that increases power. So speed is force over tide, so that will increase your mTOR. So the big notable exception here is that we know that glucose, your sugar saturation point, will turn that off. Again, the body being very, very efficient, if you're always giving high octane fuel, you're going to turn off that gene. Hemoglobin A1C is mentioned here. I'll show you as we get into the biomarkers, because that is a very accurate marker of your last 3 months, your average blood sugar levels. So like Jim alluded to earlier, measurable metrics matter. When you start to get into this and you start looking at your own physiology, then you can start kind of intellectualizing these processes. It's another piece of how you can start saying, okay, you know I shouldn't have, you know, a lot of carbs. I'm 100% paleo 70% of the time, and you can start changing that around, because and I have this conversation with clients. Just last week, a gal was like, I looked at her hemoglobin A1C. I'll show you. And she's like, I'm paleo. I'm pure paleo. I'm like, wow, that's interesting. Are you really killing it with the fruit? And she's like, no, I'm okay. I'm okay with the fruit, and so I'm like, all right, well, it's really high. I'm interested. Maybe your metabolic rate's down. So we were looking at her thyroid, and it looked okay. And then she's like, well, what about honey? I'm like, well, yeah, honey is a super saturated sugar source. And she's like, but it's natural. It's paleo. And I'm like, well, all right. But, why don't you maybe go out and try to get some honey from a beehive and see what happens, and maybe you won't have as much honey. So, but it's interesting.